fired factory worker buys lottery ticket with last dollar. What he does after winning stuns the nation. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In a small Rust Belt town, where dreams go to die and factories close their gates, one man's desperate gamble on a lottery ticket becomes the catalyst for an extraordinary chain of events. When John Callahan, a newly unemployed factory worker, wins millions with his last dollar, he doesn't jet off to a tropical paradise or buy a mansion. Instead, he embarks on a mission that will challenge the very fabric of his community, confront deep-rooted corruption, and inspire a nation. But as John's noble intentions collide with harsh realities, he'll discover that changing a town, and himself, comes at a price he never expected to pay. John Callahan's calloused hands trembled as he clutched the pink slip, the harsh fluorescent lights of the Millbrook manufacturing plant buzzing overhead like angry wasps. At 53, with graying hair and deepening lines etching his weathered face, he felt every one of his years weighing down on him. "I'm sorry, John," Mr. Peterson, the plant manager, said, not quite meeting John's eyes. "Corporate's shutting us down, shipping everything overseas." The words hung in the air, heavy as the iron girders that loomed above them. John nodded numbly, his mind racing through calculations. Mortgage payments, Sarah's college tuition, the medical bills piling up from Margaret's treatments. 30 years, John muttered, more to himself than to Peterson. "Gave this place 30 years of my life." Peterson's face tightened with a grimace. "I know, John. Believe me, if there was any other way." He trailed off, both men knowing there was nothing more to say. John shuffled out of the office, the pink slip crumpled in his fist. The factory floor, usually alive with the rhythmic clanging of machinery and shouts of workers, was eerily quiet. A ghost town in the making. He could almost see the ghosts of his younger self, eager and full of promise, working alongside his father. The Callahan men had been the backbone of Millbrook manufacturing for generations. Now it was all coming to an end. Outside, a bitter wind whipped through the parking lot, carrying the first hints of winter. John climbed into his beat-up Ford pickup, the engine protesting as he turned the key. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the looming factory walls, the faded Millbrook manufacturing sign a cruel reminder of better days. The drive home was a blur, the familiar streets of Millbrook, Ohio, taking on a sinister cast. Boarded-up storefronts and foreclosure signs dotted Main Street like tombstones. The town had been dying a slow death for years, but this, the closure of the plant, felt like the final nail in the coffin. John pulled into the driveway of the modest two-story house he'd called home for the past 25 years. He sat in the truck, dreading the moment he'd have to walk in and tell Margaret, his wife of 30 years, battling cancer with a stubborn grace that both awed and terrified him, didn't need this additional burden. With a heavy sigh, John climbed out of the truck. As he walked towards the front door, something caught his eye. A crumpled dollar bill, muddy and worn, lay in the overgrown grass of their lawn. John bent to pick it up, smoothing it out between his fingers. He stared at George Washington's faded face, a humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "Well, George," he muttered, "looks like you and I are in the same boat. Last of a dying breed." A wild, desperate idea seized him. John changed course, walking past his front door and down the cracked sidewalk. His feet carried him to Jerry's convenience store on the corner, a place he'd visited 1,000 times for after-work beers and Sunday morning papers. The bell jingled as John pushed open the door. Jerry, a round-faced man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Hey, John," Jerry called out, his cheerful tone faltering as he took in John's grim expression. "Everything okay?" John managed a weak smile. "Been better, listen, give me a scratch-off ticket. Whatever you got for $1. Jerry's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't comment. He knew John wasn't much for gambling. He pulled out a ticket, gaudy gold and red, promising millions to some lucky fool, and slid it across the counter. John handed over the muddy dollar bill, ignoring Jerry's concerned look. He took the ticket and a penny from the take-a-penny tray and started scratching. The first number, 12, no match. The second, 7, nothing. The third, 25. John's heart skipped a beat. There was a 25 in the winning numbers. His hand shaking, John kept scratching. 25, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000. The penny clattered to the floor. Holy shit, Jerry whispered, leaning over the counter. John, is that $1 million? John finished, his voice hollow with disbelief. The bell above the door jingled again as a customer entered, but neither man noticed. John stared at the ticket, his mind reeling. $1 million. It wouldn't solve everything, but it was a lifeline, a chance. As the reality of his win began to sink in, something else stirred in John's chest. Not just relief or joy, but a fierce determination. He thought of the boarded-up shops on Main Street, of the faces of his coworkers leaving the plant for the last time, of Margaret fighting her battle with unwavering courage. In that moment, standing in Jerry's convenience store with $1 million ticket in his hand, John Callahan made a decision that would change not just his life, but the fate of Millbrook itself. He looked up at Jerry, his eyes blazing with newfound purpose. Jerry, he said, his voice steady and sure, I need you to keep this quiet for now. I've got some thinking to do. Jerry nodded, still wide-eyed with shock. Sure, John, whatever you say. John pocketed the ticket and walked out of the store, leaving a bewildered Jerry in his wake. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Millbrook might be down, but it wasn't out. Not if John Callahan had anything to say about it. The next morning dawned gray and cold, but John Callahan woke with a fire in his belly that no dreary Ohio weather could extinguish. He'd spent a sleepless night turning over possibilities in his mind, the lottery ticket safely tucked away in his bedside drawer. Margaret stirred beside him, her face pale but peaceful in the weak morning light. John's heart clenched. He hadn't told her about the layoff or the lottery win yet. One earth-shattering revelation at a time. Morning sunshine, Margaret murmured, her eyes fluttering open. Even after 30 years of marriage and months of grueling chemo treatments, the sight of her smile still made John's heart skip a beat. Morning beautiful, he replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. How are you feeling today? Margaret sat up slowly, wincing slightly. Oh, you know me, tough as nails. What about you? You were tossing and turning all night. John took a deep breath. It was now or never. Maggie, I've got some news, good and bad. He told her everything, the layoff, finding the dollar, the lottery ticket. Margaret listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening with each new revelation. $1 million, she whispered when he finished. John, it's a miracle. John nodded, taking her hands in his. It is. But Maggie, I've been thinking. This money, it's not just for us. It's for Millbrook. Margaret tilted her head, a quizzical look on her face. What do you mean? John's words came in a rush, all the ideas he'd been mulling over spilling out. The town's dying, Maggie. Has been for years. But what if we could change that? What if we could use this money to breathe new life into Millbrook? Create jobs, revitalize Main Street, give people hope again. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying John's face. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her features. John Callahan, you big-hearted fool, she said softly. I think you might be onto something. Relief and excitement coursed through John. With Margaret on board, he felt invincible. I've got some ideas, he said, reaching for a notepad on the nightstand. But I'm going to need help, and we'll have to be careful. There are people in this town who won't like the boat being rocked. Margaret nodded, her expression turning serious. Mayor Hawkins and his cronies, she said. It wasn't a question. John's jaw tightened. Robert Hawkins had been mayor of Millbrook for the better part of 2 decades. And in that time, the town had gone from struggling to barely surviving. There were whispers of kickbacks, of sweetheart deals with out-of-town developers who promised jobs but delivered only empty buildings and broken promises. Yeah, John said. Hawkins and his bunch won't make this easy. But we've got to try, Maggie. For the town. For us. For Sarah. At the mention of their daughter, away at college and blissfully unaware of the turmoil back home, Margaret's eyes misted over. She'll be so proud of you, John. John squeezed her hand. Of us, he corrected. We're in this together. After breakfast, John headed into town, his mind racing with plans. His first stop was the Millbrook Gazette, a struggling local paper run by his old high school friend, Mike Reeves. The Gazette's office was a shabby storefront on Main Street, sandwiched between a payday loan shop and a dollar store. John pushed open the door, a bell jangling overhead. Mike looked up from his ancient computer, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. John Callahan, as I live and breathe, he said, breaking into a grin. What brings you to my humble abode? John settled into a worn chair across from Mike's desk. Got a story for you, Mike. A big one. Mike's eyebrows shot up. That right? Well, don't keep me in suspense, Johnny boy. John leaned forward, lowering his voice. What would you say if I told you I had a plan to revitalize Millbrook? To bring jobs back, to breathe life into Main Street again? Mike's expression turned skeptical. I'd say you've been hitting the bottle a little early, John. In case you haven't noticed, this town's on its last legs. I know, John said. Believe me, I know. But what if we had the resources to make real change? To invest in local businesses, to create a community development fund, to actually fix the things that have been broken for so long. Mike leaned back in his chair, studying John with newfound interest. And where exactly would these resources come from? John hesitated for a moment, then decided to trust his old friend. He pulled out the lottery ticket and slid it across the desk. Mike's jaw dropped as he examined the ticket. Holy, John, is this for real? John nodded. As real as it gets, Mike. But here's the thing, I don't want this to be about me. I want to use this money to help Millbrook. And I need your help to spread the word, to get people on board. Mike was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly racing. Finally, he looked up at John, a slow smile spreading across his face. John Callahan, you magnificent bastard. You might just be crazy enough to pull this off. Over the next hour, John laid out his plans to Mike. A community development fund to provide low-interest loans to local entrepreneurs. A job training program to help former factory workers transition to new careers. A Main Street beautification project to attract new businesses and visitors. Mike took furious notes, his initial skepticism giving way to genuine excitement. This could work, John, he said. It really could. But you know we're going to face opposition. Hawkins and his crowd aren't going to like someone muscling in on their turf. John nodded grimly. I know. That's why we need to build a coalition. Get the people of Millbrook behind us. Show them that change is possible. As John left the Gazette office, his head was spinning with possibilities and potential pitfalls. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, of hope. Walking down Main Street, John saw the town with new eyes. Where before he had seen only decay and despair, now he saw potential. The boarded-up storefronts could become thriving businesses. The empty lots could be transformed into community gardens or parks. But as he turned a corner, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, revealing the smug face of Mayor Robert Hawkins. John Callahan, Hawkins called out, his voice oily smooth. I heard a rumor you came into some money recently. I do hope you're planning to invest it wisely. The threat in Hawkins' words was barely veiled. John felt a chill run down his spine, but he met the mayor's gaze steadily. Don't you worry about that, Mr. Mayor, John replied, his voice level. I've got plans for Millbrook. Big plans. Hawkins' smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, isn't that interesting? I look forward to hearing all about these plans of yours. As the SUV pulled away, John watched it go, his resolve hardening. The battle for Millbrook's soul was just beginning, and John Callahan was ready to fight. The Millbrook Gazette's front page the following week sent shockwaves through the sleepy town. Local man wins lottery, pledges to revitalize Millbrook. The headline blared. Mike Reeves had outdone himself, painting a vivid picture of John's vision for a reborn Millbrook without revealing the full extent of his winnings. The response was immediate and overwhelming. John's phone began ringing off the hook, a steady stream of townsfolk reaching out with a mix of congratulations, skepticism, and desperate hope. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered on his front lawn, forcing John to step outside and address them. "Folks, please," he called out, raising his hands for quiet. The murmur of voices died down as all eyes turned to him. "I know you've got questions. I know you're wondering if this is for real. Well, I'm here to tell you it is." A woman in the front, Clara Jenkins from the old bakery on 5th Street, spoke up. "But how, John? How are you going to bring jobs back when the plants close down?" John took a deep breath. "It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but we've got to start somewhere. I'm setting up a community development fund to help local businesses get back on their feet. Clara, imagine reopening that bakery of yours, but with new equipment, maybe even a coffee shop attached." Clara's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope breaking through her weathered features. "And for those of you who worked at the plant," John continued, his gaze sweeping across familiar faces, "we're going to set up job training programs. The world's changing, and Millbrook's got to change with it. But we can do it together." As John spoke, he could see the shift in the crowd. Doubt gave way to curiosity, then to cautious optimism. By the time he finished outlining his plans, there was a palpable energy in the air, an electricity he hadn't felt in Millbrook for years. But not everyone was swept up in the excitement. From the edge of the crowd, John spotted Frank Delgado, Mayor Hawkins' right-hand man, watching with narrowed eyes. As the crowd began to disperse, Frank approached, his face a mask of fake congeniality. "Quite a show, Callahan," Frank said, clapping John on the shoulder a little too hard. "The mayor's mighty interested in these plans of yours. Why don't you swing by his office later? He'd love to collaborate." John met Frank's gaze steadily. "Thanks for the invitation, Frank. I'll be sure to set up a meeting soon." As Frank walked away, John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He knew that collaboration was the last thing on Mayor Hawkins' mind. The real fight was just beginning. Over the next few weeks, John threw himself into making his vision a reality. He set up the Millbrook Renaissance Fund, seeding it with a substantial portion of his lottery winnings. Working with Mike Reeves and a small team of trusted advisors, including his old union rep, Doris Wheeler, John began accepting applications for small business loans and job training programs. The first success story came quicker than anyone expected. Clara Jenkins, emboldened by John's encouragement, submitted a business plan for a revamped bakery and cafe. With a low-interest loan from the fund and support from local volunteers, Clara's Sweet Spot opened its doors just a month later. On opening day, the line stretched down the block. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee wafted through the air. And for the first time in years, Main Street buzzed with life and laughter. John stood at the back of the crowd, watching with a lump in his throat as Clara cut the ribbon, her hands shaking but her smile radiant. "You did good, John," a voice said beside him. He turned to see Margaret, looking stronger than she had in months, her eyes shining with pride. John wrapped an arm around her waist. "We did good," he corrected. "This is just the beginning." But even as Millbrook began to stir with new life, opposition was brewing. Mayor Hawkins and his supporters weren't about to let their grip on the town slip away without a fight. The first salvo came in the form of sudden health inspections of businesses that had received loans from John's fund. Then came whispers of zoning violations and outdated permits. It was clear that Hawkins was using every bureaucratic tool at his disposal to stymie John's efforts. The tension came to a head one crisp October evening at a town council meeting. The small municipal building was packed to the rafters, with residents spilling out onto the steps outside. John sat in the front row, flanked by Margaret and Mike Reeves, as Mayor Hawkins called the meeting to order. "Friends and neighbors," Hawkins began, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. We're here tonight to discuss the recent activities of Mr. John Callahan and his so-called Renaissance Fund. A murmur rippled through the crowd. John felt Margaret's hand tighten around his. Hawkins continued, his tone hardening. While Mr. Callahan's intentions may be noble, we must consider the long-term implications of his actions. These loans, these programs, they're unsustainable. And more importantly, they're circumventing the proper channels of government that we've established to protect our town. John couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood, facing not just Hawkins but the entire room. With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, what's unsustainable is the way this town has been run into the ground. People are hurting. They need jobs, they need hope. And if the proper channels aren't providing that, then it's up to us, all of us, to step up. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and angry shouts. As John looked around, he saw the battle lines being drawn. On one side, those who had benefited from Hawkins' regime, the contractors who always seemed to win the bids, the developers whose empty promises lined their pockets. On the other, the working folks of Millbrook, daring to hope for the first time in years. In that moment, John realized that revitalizing Millbrook wasn't just about creating jobs or sprucing up Main Street. It was about changing the very soul of the town, about giving power back to the people who called it home. As the meeting devolved into chaos, with Hawkins frantically banging his gavel, John caught Margaret's eye. She nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. The real battle for Millbrook's future had begun, and they were ready to fight. The weeks following the tumultuous town council meeting were a whirlwind of activity for John Callahan. Word of Millbrook's budding renaissance had spread beyond the town limits, attracting attention from regional news outlets and even a few curious investors. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny, and John found himself walking a tightrope between hope and caution. One chilly November morning, John sat at his kitchen table, poring over applications for the latest round of small business loans. The Millbrook Renaissance Fund had already helped launch or revitalize a dozen local enterprises, from Clara's Bakery to a small tech startup run by a group of former factory workers. But for every success story, there were a dozen more desperate pleas for help. Margaret entered the kitchen, her steps a little steadier these days. The stress of recent events seemed to have galvanized her, giving her a renewed sense of purpose in her own battle against cancer. "You're going to wear out those eyes of yours," she chided gently, setting a steaming mug of coffee beside him. John looked up with a weary smile. "Just trying to make sure we're making the right choices. There's so much need out there, Maggie. Sometimes I feel like we're trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon." Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "One teaspoon at a time, if that's what it takes. You're giving people hope, John. That's worth more than any amount of money." Their moment of quiet reflection was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. John opened it to find Mike Reeves, his face flushed with a mix of excitement and anxiety. "John, you need to see this," Mike said, thrusting a file folder into John's hands. "I've been doing some digging into Mayor Hawkins' dealings, and, well, just take a look." John flipped open the folder, his eyes widening as he scanned the documents inside. Financial records, email printouts, blurry photographs, all pointing to a web of corruption far more extensive than he had imagined. "My God," John muttered. "Kickbacks from developers, rigged contract bids, misappropriated funds. Mike, this is dynamite." Mike nodded grimly. "And it gets worse. See that name there? James Callahan." John felt the blood drain from his face. James Callahan, his older brother, who had left Millbrook years ago for a high-powered job in Columbus. The brother he had always looked up to, always defended. "James is involved in this?" John's voice was barely a whisper. Mike's expression was sympathetic but firm. "It looks like he's been acting as a go-between for Hawkins and some big developers out of Columbus." "John, I'm sorry, but your brother's neck-deep in this mess." John sank into a chair, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering, not just for Millbrook, but for his family, for everything he thought he knew. Margaret, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "What are you going to do, John?" It was the question that had been hanging in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. John looked from Margaret to Mike, then down at the damning evidence in his hands. "We have to bring this to light," he said finally, his voice gaining strength. "All of it, no matter who gets caught in the fallout." Mike nodded, a mix of relief and resolve on his face. "I was hoping you'd say that. But John, you need to understand, once we publish this, there's no going back. Hawkins and his crowd will come at us with everything they've got." "I know," John said, "but we can't let them keep bleeding this town dry. Not when we're so close to turning things around." The next few days were a blur of activity. John, Mike, and a small trusted team worked around the clock, corroborating evidence and preparing their exposé. They decided to release the information in stages, starting with the smaller instances of corruption and building up to the bigger revelations. The first article hit the front page of the Millbrook Gazette on a Wednesday morning. "Special Investigation: The Hidden Costs of Millbrook's Development Deals," screamed the headline. By noon, the town was buzzing with shocked conversations and angry phone calls. Mayor Hawkins wasted no time in launching a counteroffensive. He called a press conference, denouncing the article as fake news and threatening legal action against the Gazette. But John and Mike had done their homework. Every accusation was backed up with solid evidence, and they were just getting started. As the week wore on and more articles were published, the mood in Millbrook shifted. Shock gave way to anger, then to a grim determination. People who had long suspected something was rotten in the town's leadership now had proof, and they weren't about to let it slide. But even as public opinion turned against Hawkins and his cronies, John found himself grappling with a more personal dilemma. The evidence of his brother's involvement weighed heavily on him. James had always been the golden boy of the family, the one who made it out of Millbrook and found success. Now, John had to confront the possibility that that success had come at a terrible price. Late one night, as John sat in his study wrestling with what to do, his phone rang. The caller ID made his heart skip a beat. "James." "Johnny." His brother's voice came through, sounding strained and unfamiliar. "We need to talk." John closed his eyes, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. "Yeah, James, I think we do." As he agreed to meet his brother the next day, John knew he was stepping into uncharted territory. The fight for Millbrook's future was no longer just about revitalizing a struggling town. It had become a battle for its very soul and for the Callahan family legacy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change Millbrook and the Callahan brothers forever. The diner on the outskirts of Millbrook had seen better days. Its once cheerful red booths now faded to a dusty pink. It was neutral ground, far from prying eyes, the perfect place for two brothers to hash out a family crisis. John arrived first, sliding into a booth near the back. He ordered coffee, black, and waited, his stomach churning with a mix of anxiety and anger. When James walked in 10 minutes later, John barely recognized him. Gone was the cocky stride, the perfectly pressed suit. This James looked haggard, his eyes darting nervously around the diner. "Johnny," James said, slipping into the booth. "Thanks for meeting me." John nodded curtly. "Start talking, James. I want to hear it from you." Over the next hour, fueled by bottomless cups of mediocre coffee, James spilled everything. How it had started small, a favor here, a blind eye turned there. How the money had been too good to pass up, especially with a family to support back in Columbus. How things had spiraled out of control until he found himself in too deep to back out. "I never meant for it to go this far, Johnny," James said, his voice cracking. "I thought I was helping bring business to Millbrook. I didn't realize." "Didn't realize?" John cut in, his voice sharp. "Or didn't want to realize? Christ, James, you were bleeding this town dry. Our town. Dad's town." James flinched at the mention of their father. "I know. God, I know. But Johnny, you've got to understand, Hawkins has dirt on everyone. If this comes out, it's not just me who goes down. There are good people who'll be caught in the crossfire." John leaned back, studying his brother. The golden boy, the success story, now a broken man pleading for mercy. Part of him wanted to reach out to offer comfort. But a harder, colder part remembered the struggling families of Millbrook, the closed shops, the lost hopes. I can't bury this, James, John said finally. The town deserves the truth. But, he added, seeing his brother's face crumple, I can give you a chance to come clean on your own terms. Work with Mike and me. Help us expose the whole rotten system. It might not save you from consequences, but it'll count for something. James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to all of life's problems. Finally, he looked up, meeting John's gaze. Okay, he said softly. Okay, Johnny, I'll do it. For Dad. For Millbrook. As the brothers left the diner, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The Callahan name had been tarnished, but perhaps, together, they could begin to polish it again. The next week was a whirlwind of activity. James worked with John and Mike, providing insider details that blew the corruption case wide open. The Millbrook Gazette ran a series of explosive articles, each one more damning than the last. Mayor Hawkins and his inner circle scrambled to do damage control, but the evidence was overwhelming. The climax came on a frigid December morning. John stood on the steps of the Millbrook courthouse, flanked by Mike, James, and a group of determined citizens. At his nod, Mike stepped forward to address the crowd of townspeople and reporters. People of Millbrook, Mike began, his voice ringing out clear and strong. For too long, our town has been strangled by corruption and greed. Today, we say no more. He went on to outline the evidence they had gathered, painting a damning picture of years of mismanagement and outright theft. As he spoke, John watched the faces in the crowd. Shock gave way to anger, then to a fierce determination. When Mike finished, John stepped up to the microphone. I know many of you are angry, he said. You have every right to be. But today isn't just about exposing wrongdoing. It's about charting a new course for Millbrook. He laid out his vision, a town run with transparency and integrity, where every citizen had a voice and an opportunity to thrive. As he spoke, he could feel the mood of the crowd shifting. The anger was still there, but now it was tempered with hope. Millbrook has been knocked down, John concluded, but we're not out. Together, we can rebuild this town into something we can all be proud of. Who's with me? The roar of the crowd was deafening. In the weeks that followed, Millbrook underwent a seismic shift. Mayor Hawkins and several council members resigned in disgrace. State investigators descended on the town, combing through years of records. James, true to his word, turned himself in to the authorities. But even as the old guard fell, new leaders emerged. A coalition of citizens, inspired by John's example, stepped up to fill the void. They organized town halls, formed committees, and began the painstaking work of rebuilding Millbrook's government from the ground up. Through it all, John remained at the center, a steady hand guiding the town through choppy waters. But the strain was beginning to show. Late one night, as he pored over budget proposals in his study, Margaret appeared in the doorway. John, she said softly, we need to talk. John looked up from his papers, the lines on his face deepening as he took in Margaret's serious expression. What is it, Maggie? Is everything okay? Margaret moved into the room, perching on the edge of his desk. That's what I wanted to ask you, John. When's the last time you got a full night's sleep? Or had a meal that wasn't from a takeout container? John rubbed his eyes, suddenly aware of the bone-deep fatigue that had become his constant companion. I'm fine, Maggie. There's just so much to do. The town will still be here tomorrow, Margaret cut in gently. But I'm worried about you, John. You're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, and I can see it crushing you. John started to protest, but the words died in his throat as he met Margaret's gaze. He saw concern there, yes, but also a steely determination that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her all those years ago. You're right, he admitted finally. I've been so focused on saving the town that I haven't been taking care of myself. Or you, he added, a pang of guilt hitting him as he realized how little time they had spent together lately. Margaret took his hand, her touch warm and comforting. I know you feel responsible for Millbrook, John, and what you've done, it's incredible. But you can't do it all alone. It's time to start trusting others to carry some of the load. As if on cue, John's phone buzzed with a text from Mike Reeves. Another crisis, another decision that needed to be made. John reached for the phone, then paused, looking back at Margaret. "Go on," she said with a small smile. "But tomorrow we're taking a day off, just you and me. The town will survive without you for 24 hours. John nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He fired off a quick response to Mike, then stood, pulling Margaret into a tight embrace. "What would I do without you?" he murmured into her hair. Margaret chuckled. "Probably work yourself into an early grave. Now go save the world. But remember to come back to me." The next day, true to their agreement, John and Margaret retreated to a small cabin in the woods outside of town. It was a place they had visited often in their younger days, a sanctuary from the pressures of work and family. As they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees, John felt the tension of the past months begin to melt away. "I'd almost forgotten how beautiful it is out here," he said, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. Margaret leaned into him. "Sometimes we need to step back to remember what we're fighting for." As night fell, they really talked, for the first time in months, about their fears, their hopes, the toll the past year had taken on them both. Margaret spoke of her ongoing battle with cancer, the strength she drew from seeing the town come back to life. John confessed his doubts, the nightmares that plagued him of letting everyone down. In the quiet of the forest, they reconnected, reminding each other of the partnership that had weathered so many storms. When they returned to Millbrook the next day, John felt rejuvenated, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and he didn't have to wait long for the next one. As he walked into his office at the Renaissance Fund headquarters, a renovated storefront on Main Street, he was greeted by a grim-faced Mike Reeves and Doris Wheeler, his old union rep who had become a key ally in the town's revitalization efforts. "What's wrong?" John asked, immediately sensing the tension in the room. Mike and Doris exchanged a look before Mike spoke. "We've got a problem, John. A big one. Remember that tech startup we funded? The one run by the ex-factory workers?" John nodded. It had been one of their early success stories, a group of laid-off workers who had retrained and started a small software company. "Well," Mike continued, "they just landed a major contract. It could mean dozens of new jobs for Millbrook." "That's great news," John said, confused by their somber expressions. "Isn't it?" Doris sighed. "It would be, except for one thing. To fulfill the contract, they need to expand. Fast. And the only suitable property in town is the old Millbrook manufacturing plant," John finished, the implications hitting him like a truck. The plant had been sitting empty since the layoffs, a hulking reminder of the town's decline. John had been working on plans to repurpose it, maybe turn it into a community center or a mixed-use development. But this was different. "If we help them buy and renovate the plant," Mike explained, "it could jumpstart Millbrook's economy in a big way. But it means giving up on the idea of bringing manufacturing back," John said quietly. It was a hope he had clung to, even as he worked to diversify the town's economy. The thought of the plant humming to life again, providing the kind of steady, well-paying jobs that had built Millbrook, had been a powerful motivator. Doris leaned forward, her eyes intense. "John, we need to make a decision fast. If we don't move on this, they might take the company and the jobs elsewhere." John stood, moving to the window that overlooked Main Street. He could see Clara's bakery across the way, bustling with morning customers. A little further down, a new boutique was preparing for its grand opening, signs of life, of renewal. But as he looked, he also saw the ghosts of what had been. The men and women who had poured their lives into the factory, who had built a community around honest, hard work. His own father, coming home tired but proud after a long day on the assembly line. John turned back to Mike and Doris, his decision made. "Call a town hall meeting," he said. "Tonight. This isn't just my decision to make. If we're going to change the future of Millbrook, we need to do it together." As Mike and Doris left to make the arrangements, John sank into his chair, the weight of the world settling back onto his shoulders. But this time it felt different. This time he knew he wasn't carrying it alone. The choice facing Millbrook was more than just a business decision. It was a referendum on the town's identity, on its very soul. As John began to prepare for the meeting, he knew that whatever the outcome, Millbrook would never be the same again, and neither would he. The Millbrook High School gymnasium was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension and anticipation. John stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of familiar faces. Friends, neighbors, people he had known his entire life, all waiting to hear what the future might hold for their beloved town. "Friends," John began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "We're here tonight because Millbrook stands at a crossroads. The decision we make will shape the future of our town for generations to come." He laid out the situation, the tech company's offer, the potential for new jobs, and the implications of repurposing the old factory. As he spoke, he could see the conflict playing out on the faces before him. Hope warred with nostalgia, progress with tradition. "I know what the factory means to this town," John continued, his voice softening. "My father worked there. Many of your parents and grandparents worked there. It was the heartbeat of Millbrook for generations. But times have changed, and we need to decide if we're going to change with them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. John saw old Joe Hansen, who had worked at the plant for 40 years, shaking his head. But next to him sat his granddaughter, Sarah, her eyes shining with excitement at the prospect of a tech job that might keep her in Millbrook. "Now, I'm not here to tell you what to do," John said, gripping the sides of the podium. "This isn't my decision to make alone. It's ours. So let's talk it out. Let's hear from all of you." For the next 2 hours, the gymnasium became a forum for passionate debate. Old-timers spoke of the dignity of manufacturing work, the pride of creating something tangible. Younger residents argued for embracing new industries, for positioning Millbrook for the future. Through it all, John moderated, ensuring every voice was heard. He watched as the discussion evolved, as people who entered the room with fixed opinions began to consider new perspectives. As the meeting wound down, an unexpected voice called out from the back of the room. "I'd like to say something, if I may." The crowd parted, revealing Margaret. She had insisted on coming despite her fatigue, saying this was too important to miss. John nodded, helping her to the podium. Margaret looked out over the crowd, her gaze steady. "I've lived in Millbrook my whole life," she began. "I've seen it in good times and bad. And let me tell you something, what makes this town special isn't a building or an industry. It's the people. It's all of you." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The world is changing, whether we like it or not. But that doesn't mean we have to lose who we are. We can honor our past while building our future. That old factory? It built more than just products. It built a community. And that's what we need to remember as we move forward." A hush fell over the gymnasium as Margaret's words resonated. John felt a swell of pride and love for his wife, marveling at her wisdom and strength. "So I say," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger, "let's take this opportunity. Let's show the world that Millbrook isn't stuck in the past. We're ready for the future, but we're bringing the best parts of our history with us." As Margaret stepped back from the podium, the gym erupted in applause. John watched as people turned to their neighbors, nodding and talking animatedly. Something had shifted in the room, a new energy, a sense of possibility. "All right," John said, returning to the podium. "I think we've all got a lot to think about. Let's take a few days to reflect, to talk with our families and neighbors. We'll reconvene next week for a vote. Whatever we decide, we'll do it together." As the crowd began to disperse, John felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Clara Jenkins, the bakery owner, standing there with tears in her eyes. "John," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I just wanted to say, whatever happens, thank you for giving us hope again, for reminding us what it means to be a community." John swallowed hard, touched by Clara's words. As he looked around the gym, he saw similar expressions on many faces: gratitude, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. The decision still lay ahead, but in that moment, John knew that Millbrook had already won. They had rediscovered their voice, their power to shape their own destiny. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The week leading up to the vote was a whirlwind of activity. The town buzzed with discussion, debate, and a palpable sense of anticipation. John spent his days meeting with various groups, answering questions, and helping to refine the proposal for the factory's transformation. On the evening before the vote, John found himself once again in his study, poring over the final details. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. "Come in," he called, expecting Margaret. Instead, it was Sarah, his daughter, home from college for the vote. "Hey, Dad," she said, perching on the edge of his desk like she used to as a little girl. "How are you holding up?" John leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter's face. She looked so grown up, so sure of herself. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just trying to make sure we've covered all our bases." Sarah nodded, then hesitated. "Dad, I want you to know how proud I am of you. What you've done for Millbrook, it's incredible." John felt a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot. But," Sarah continued, her voice gentle, "I'm worried about you and Mom. This has all taken such a toll. After the vote, promise me you'll take a step back? Let others take the lead for a while." John was silent for a moment, struck by the role reversal. When had his little girl become so wise? "You're right," he said finally. "Whatever happens tomorrow, it's time to start passing the torch. This was never meant to be a one-man show." Sarah smiled, leaning in to hug her father. "Good, because Millbrook's going to need you around for a long time to come." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn day. As John and Margaret walked to the town hall, leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was filled with the excited chatter of townsfolk heading to vote. The polling station was set up in the main chamber of the town hall. All day, a steady stream of people filed in to cast their ballots. John and Margaret spent the day at Clara's Bakery, which had become an unofficial headquarters for the revitalization efforts. As evening fell, the votes were tallied. The town hall was packed once again as Mayor Pro Tem Linda Chan, who had stepped in after Hawkins' resignation, took the podium to announce the results. "Citizens of Millbrook," Linda began, her voice ringing out clear and strong, "I'm pleased to announce that with a vote of 68% in favor, the proposal to repurpose the Millbrook manufacturing plant has passed." A cheer went up from the crowd, though John could see some disappointed faces as well. He made a mental note to reach out to those who had opposed the measure, to ensure their voices weren't lost in the transition. Linda continued, outlining the next steps, the sale of the property, the renovation plans, the job training programs that would be implemented. As she spoke, John felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This was no longer just his vision. It belonged to all of Millbrook now. After the announcement, there was an impromptu celebration on Main Street. String lights were hastily hung between buildings, music played from portable speakers, and Clara's Bakery handed out free pastries. The air was electric with possibility. As John moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and fielding questions, he caught sight of a familiar face. His brother James, standing at the edge of the gathering. John made his way over, unsure of what to say. James spoke first. "Congratulations, Johnny. You did it." "We did it," John corrected. "Your testimony coming clean. It made a difference, James." James nodded, his eyes misty. "I've got a long road ahead, making amends. But seeing this," he gestured to the celebrating crowd, "it gives me hope, for Millbrook and for myself." The brothers embraced, years of tension and misunderstanding melting away in the face of new beginnings. As the party wound down, John found Margaret sitting on a bench, watching the scene with a contented smile. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "So," Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "what's next for the great John Callahan?" John chuckled. "Honestly, a vacation. A long one. With you." Margaret laughed, the sound music to John's ears. "I'll hold you to that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as their friends and neighbors celebrated the dawn of a new era for Millbrook. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still challenges to face, wounds to heal. But as John looked out over the town he loved, he felt a profound sense of peace. Millbrook had been down but never out. And now, thanks to the efforts of not just one man, but an entire community coming together, it was rising again. Stronger, more resilient, and ready for whatever the future might bring. As the last of the revelers headed home, John and Margaret stood, hand in hand. They began the walk back to their house, leaving behind the noise and excitement. But with each step, John felt the weight of responsibility lifting, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment and hope. Millbrook's story was far from over, but the next chapter, that was for others to write. Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.